Hi, I'm Phil at the Soundproofing store, and today we're at the Sportsman's Arms Hotel and Restaurant in Pateley Bridge in Yorkshire. And what an absolutely stunning place this is. Now, the Sportsman's is owned by the Carter family, and they reached out about a little noise problem they're having. And this is Jamie to tell us all about it. Hi, Jamie.
Hi, Phil.
So tell us about the Sportsman's.
So the Sportsman's Arms has been within our family for almost 50 years now.
Wow.
And it's a small countryside inn, and we have 11 rooms for accommodation, a restaurant and a bar. So a busy small business in the middle of the Yorkshire Dales.
Absolutely, and a beautiful one at that, I've got to say. Now, you reached out because you've got a noise problem. Tell us all about it.
Yeah, the main building is absolutely fine. It's the construction is solid, very thick masonry walls. However, we more recently had a barn conversion done of a disused barn towards the back of the property, and that's more modern construction techniques. So stud walls and wooden floors, which we've found to be a problem with noise whilst people are staying.
Okay, so the barn's down this way. So lightweight stud walls separating the rooms, timber floors with plasterboard ceilings. It's all very lightweight.
Yeah.
Sounds travelling through very easily. And how does that affect things as a hotel?
People come to this part of the world for a bit of tranquility and peace. And the last thing that we want to do is send them home having had a disturbed night's stay because of noise generated from rooms either side.
Especially when it's not something that you can control. You do everything else that you can absolutely perfect to give them a lovely time, but then a neighbour next door snoring or watching the TV at night can potentially ruin that, and that's not something that you're able to control as a hotel.
Absolutely. We try to make sure that people leave having a lovely stay, and we want them to come back. And we work very hard to do that. However, like you say, people often leave televisions on, or people can have problems with snoring, and that can really dampen their experience of our hotel.
Well, we're going to try and fix that for you, Jamie.
Perfect.
So we're going to treat the wall and we're going to treat the floor. But what we're going to do for the viewers at home is split them up into two separate videos, so it's not too long. So if you're currently watching our wall video but want to find out about the floors, there will be a link in the description, and vice versa. If you're watching the floor video, we'll have a link to the wall video as well. Now we're going to go inside and have a look at the room. So we're now in the room where we're having the noise problems, and we're going to soundproof the floor. Now, some eagle-eyed viewers may have already spotted we've got some soundproofing on the wall behind me, which we've shot as a separate video. And if you're interested in that, we'll leave a link at the end of this video for our wall soundproofing. But for now, we're going to concentrate on the floors. Now, the main issues here are airborne sound. So that's things like voices, television, sneezing, snoring, all those kind of sounds that are projected out into the air are both traveling up from the room below up to this room, and also down from this room down to the people below. But the other thing with the floor is we also have what we call impact noise. Now that is where there's a physical structural impact that creates a very strong vibration. So things like footsteps on the floor, moving furniture, things being dropped on the floor and creating those bangs and thuds. So that's more impacts that are happening above and the noise traveling down below. So they're the two things that we need to deal with. Now, the floor is a very typical internal suspended floor construction. We've got timber joists, we've got 18mm tongue and groove chipboards that are giving us our structural floor. On the ceiling below, it's just a standard plasterboard, just a single sheet. There's also spotlights in the ceiling, so there's holes cut out of the plasterboard to put the spotlights. So the ceiling isn't doing a huge amount. So in terms of airborne sound, we need to add a lot more mass to the structure, because the plasterboard with holes in and the chipboard is just not enough mass and density to block the sound and create a barrier to stop the sound passing through it. So we need to add a lot more mass to the floor. The second thing we need to do is add some resilience, some cushioning onto the floor. So when we step on it or we drop an item on there, the floor is able to dampen and absorb that impact and soak it up, so we're not creating a strong vibration into the structure itself. Now the third thing is that with a floor like this, you have a hollow cavity between the floor above and the ceiling below. And that creates something called the drum effect, which is where any sound that gets into that hollow space is going to bounce around and resonate and amplify. And a lot of people will have experienced this in their lives, where if you're walking around on the floor above, it doesn't seem very loud to you. But when you go downstairs and hear someone else walk on the floor above, it sounds like a herd of elephants, because the sound is actually resonating and amplifying and becoming louder. And the way we stop that is by putting an acoustic insulation in between the joists. Okay, now this doesn't block the original sound, but it stops the sound from bouncing around and resonating in that cavity space. Now in this case, there's actually already some mineral wool insulation already between the joists. That was done at the time that the building was converted. Now, if you haven't got insulation in your joists, you will need to lift your floorboards up, put some insulation between the joists and put the floorboards back down. Or go downstairs and take off your ceiling, put the insulation in and reboard the ceiling. But in this case, we've already got insulation. We don't need to do that part. We're just adding something on top. So for this project, we decided to use our SoundMat 3 Plus. Okay, now that is because, one, it's relatively slim. It's not going to build the height of the floor up too much, which is good for an existing room. We don't want to have to mess around too much with doors and things like that. And also it's the perfect solution when installing a soft finish like a carpet on top, because the SoundMat has some compression to it, so it'll feel like a high quality underlay, and that you can actually install your carpet straight on top and use the SoundMat as your underlay. So it's really good if you've got a carpet finish. You can install other finishes on top as well, and we'll go into that a little bit later, but that's why we've chosen it in this case. Now the SoundMat is made up of 3 layers. The layer on the top and the bottom are the same. It's what we call mass loaded vinyl, which is a very heavy, very dense viscoelastic rubber. And the idea of that really is that it's adding a lot of weight and mass and density to the floor to create a barrier across the floor that's going to block a lot more sound, because it's mass that predominantly blocks airborne sound. But in the middle of those 2 layers, there's what we call an acoustic closed cell foam. Now that foam is what gives it that spring, that cushioning. You can see it actually squidges a little bit, but it's the perfect density that, unlike a lightweight foam or a cheap carpet underlay, the foam doesn't crush through, so your footfall isn't going to go through it and still hit the floor. The SoundMat actually just compresses slightly, just enough to dampen that impact, but it actually holds your weight up off the floor and then springs back again, okay? And that's going to dampen and absorb that impact, that footfall noise. Now, the SoundMat 3 is very straightforward to install, okay? You don't need a professional soundproofing installer. You just need a good level of DIY skills. So if you are a good DIYer yourself, you can install it yourself, and a lot of our customers do install this themselves. If not, just a local builder, tradesman, joiner, someone like that is absolutely perfect. The Soundproofing store supplies all the step-by-step instructions, and of course we're on hand for technical support throughout to answer any questions and talk you through anything that you're struggling with. But in this case, Jamie from the Sportsman's, who's a handy guy, he's got good DIY skills, he does a lot of the maintenance around the hotel, he's going to install this with just a little bit of help from me. So the first step of installation is the perimeter edge detail. Now what you do around the perimeter is going to change depending on the floor finish that you're installing on top. Now in this case we're installing carpet, but what I'm going to do is show you how you would install it if you were doing a different floor finish, just so you can see that as well. So starting with carpet, along with the SoundMat we also provide what we call a carpet gripper riser. Okay, now this is a thin strip. It's got a layer of mass loaded vinyl on the bottom, which is the same heavy dense rubber that's in the SoundMat, and it's going to help stop that airborne sound from traveling up. But on top we've got a layer of plywood which we can fix into, and on the side, or on one side, is a layer of foam, okay, which is going to act as an isolator. Now the very first thing we're going to do is lay the gripper riser on the floor up against your skirting board, with the foam side pushing up against your skirting board. And what that's basically doing is isolating the hard part of the riser and of the floor from your wall, so we don't get what we call flanking vibration, which is where the vibration from impact on the floor transfers into your wall. Okay, then once your gripper riser is up against your skirting, we're going to push the SoundMat up against the gripper riser, so it's all butted up against. And then when you come to install your carpet fitter can install the gripper rods on top of the riser, which is now going to be nice and flush with the top of the SoundMat and with a little bit of a gap behind, so your carpet can run across your SoundMat, across the gripper rod, and then be tucked down behind to your skirting board. Now you can install other floor finishes on top of the SoundMat. Now if you're installing something thick and solid like an engineered wood, let's say a 15mm or thicker, because that's quite structurally strong on its own, you can install an engineered wood straight on top of the SoundMat. If you're going to install something thinner or more flexible, like a laminate floor or vinyl or even tiles, what you're going to need to do is add some stabilization to the floor. Because the SoundMat's got that little bit of compression, if you put something thin like a vinyl or a thin laminate floor, and then you step on it, the SoundMat is going to compress, and the floor finish on top is going to compress with it, which means you might get joints popping out or vinyl tearing, you might get splits in your tile grout, and so on. So for laminates or vinyls or tiles, what you would need to do is add another layer on top of the SoundMat, which is going to stabilize the floor a bit more. Now generally it's going to be a 6mm or maybe even a 9mm plywood or MDF on top of the SoundMat, and that's just going to stop it from bending and bowing quite as much. Alternatively, you can have a look at another product we do called the Reverso SoundMat. Now this has a stabilizing layer built into it to save you a bit of extra time and effort installing a second layer on top. Now if you are installing any of those floor types, what you'll need to do is use what we call a perimeter flanking strip. Now this is a 5mm thick soft foam, and this foam strip basically gets installed along the bottom of your wall, just like that, and you'd install the SoundMat and your stabilizing layer and your floor finish all right up against this foam strip. And again, it just isolates those hard layers of the floor from the wall, so we don't get flanking vibrations spreading from the floor into the wall and then getting into the structure from there. Let's say this little piece of timber represents our stabilizing board and the floor finish on top. That would also butt up against the flanking strip. You'd then fold the flanking strip over the top, install your skirting board on top of the flanking strip, which also then is isolating your skirting board from your hard floor finishes. And then once your skirting board is all installed, you just use a Stanley knife to cut off the excess flanking strip, so you're not going to see that, and you'll run a bead of sealant or a little trim to cover that up. Okay, so a couple of quick things about the floor. Now, if you have more old-fashioned style kind of plank floorboards, you're very likely to probably have a lot of gaps and holes and things in them. Now, laying the SoundMats on top is going to block those gaps up to a degree, but it's good practice to seal them up first just to make sure. So just get some acoustic sealant and just run a bead along all those joins and fill in any holes and any gaps, get it as sealed and airtight as possible, and then we add the SoundMat on top, and that's going to give you a better result. Now in this case, we've got 18mm tongue and groove chipboards, so they're very interlocked. There's not really any kind of gaps or anything. All we have got is a couple of holes around radiator pipes, which is another place to check. So we're going to seal around them with a bit of acoustic sealant and get them all sorted. In terms of levelness of the floor, If you're installing carpet, it's not too much of an issue if the floor is a little bit unlevel, because the sound mat will follow the floor and the carpet will follow the sound mat, and that's okay. If you are going to be doing sound mat and then a harder finish like a laminate or vinyl or tiles or anything else, you really do need to make sure that your floor is nice and smooth and level, or otherwise you're going to get undulations in the floor, and when you step on one of those dips, your floor finish is going to move and potentially break up and fall apart. Now we are pretty much ready to get started with the perimeter detail. We're just cutting and laying the gripper rod risers now, and then we're going to fix them down. Now there's a couple of ways you can fix them down, either using a little nail and just bang it in with a hammer, or you can just use a short screw and screwdriver. It's only really a kind of temporary fix, because once you put your gripper rods on top, you're then going to fix down with them as well. It's just to basically keep them in place and stop them shifting around while we're installing the mats. To thresholds. So we're at a point now where in this doorway we're transitioning from the soundproof floor on this side to the unsoundproof floor on the other side. Okay, now by using the sound mat and then carpet on this side, it's going to be probably about 5 or 6 mil higher than it was before, and on this side we've just got a thin laminate floor. Now you may be able to reuse the threshold bar that you already have in your doorway, depending on the type you've got. You may need to buy a new threshold bar. There's lots of different threshold bars on the market to transition to different heights, so you just have to find a suitable one. But what we're doing is putting a gripper riser across the threshold, just like we were for the gripper rods. But instead of putting a gripper rod on top, we're going to put the threshold bar back down, and we're going to fix the carpet side of the threshold bar onto the top of the riser, again just like with the gripper rods. And once it's on, we can then mallet down this side so it bends down to the right angle to transition back down to the laminate floor. You'll have a nice smooth little ramp from the lower floor to the higher floor. So before we start laying the sound mats, we're going to do a couple of quick tests so we can compare before soundproofing and after the soundproofing has been installed. Now we're going to do an airborne sound test. This is where we go down to the room below. We're going to take a little speaker with us and play some music at a pretty reasonable volume, and we're going to measure the decibel level in that room. Then we're going to come upstairs and measure the decibel level in this room, okay, to see how much sound is getting through and how much the floor and the ceiling is reducing. And then once we've soundproofed, we're going to carry out the same test and see if it's reducing more sound than it was before. Then we're also going to do what we call an impact test. Now this is just more of a homemade impact test to show a real life difference in sound, where we're literally just going to have someone upstairs walking around on the floors and measure the decibel level down below to see how much of that thud, thud, thud of the footsteps is coming down into the room. And then again, we'll do the same test afterwards with the sound mats down. Okay, so we're going to play some music now and measure the volume in here. So downstairs, the volume was fluctuating between kind of 65 and 70 decibels. So that's the volume of like a loud conversation or watching the TV or something at a pretty decent volume, probably louder than you would really normally have it kind of at home. Now we're going to measure the volume up here. So the volume in this room is measuring around the 40 decibels kind of mark. So we can certainly hear the sound up here. We can hear it quite clearly. It's not really, really loud. So the floor and the ceiling are certainly doing something. It's reducing probably about 25 decibels. But we can hear it come up still quite loud and quite clear. The background volume in the room when there's no music playing is about 35, 36 decibels. So that's really where we want to try and get it down to roughly. Okay, and now we're going to do an impact test. Now, again, this is more of a homemade test, just to show the real life difference that it's going to make in the hotel. And this is where we're expecting to get the biggest difference, really. Now, we've got someone walking around on the floor upstairs, and in this room, so we're hitting around the 50 decibel mark at the peak of the footsteps. So that's pretty loud. It's in here in real life. That is very loud, very clear, and certainly would be very disruptive to someone staying in this room downstairs. So now all the gripper risers are in place. It's just simply a case of laying the mats onto the floor and pushing them into place. Now, you don't need to fix the mats down in any way. They're very heavy. They're about 23 kilograms per mat. So they're not going to shift around when you walk on them. You have to physically push them around to move them anywhere. And once they're installed wall to wall, they're tight in place and they can't go anywhere. So you don't need to fix them down. You can glue them if you wish, and we can supply an adhesive to do that. But really, you just need to loose lay them. And as you can see, these are just literally just lying in place. What you don't want to do is mechanically fix with screws. If you put any screws or nails into the mat going through into the floor below, then when you walk across the floor, if you impact on top of a screw head, the vibration is going to go through the screw and into the floor below. So we don't want that. So adhesive if you want, but you really don't need to, but certainly no mechanical fixings. In terms of the edge, if you're lucky enough to have walls that are perfectly straight, the mats will just butt up in place perfectly. But the chances are your walls will have a little bit of a curve or a bow, in which case when you butt up, if you get any small gaps between the gripper riser and the mats, if it's a very, very small gap, smaller than 5 millimeters, don't worry about that too much. You can fill that gap with some acoustic sealant. But if the gaps are quite big in places, then you will need to scribe the edge of the mat to the shape of the wall, trim it off and push it in, and it should slot in nice like a jigsaw puzzle. Now, the mats are very easy to cut with a powered saw. Now, I would really recommend a circular saw to cut straight lines, so you get a nice smooth straight cut. If you're doing any scribing or cutting any funny shapes, a jigsaw will be absolutely fine. You can cut through the mats with a handsaw or a knife, but it's going to be laborious and messy and you're going to get very wonky cuts. So I would definitely recommend circular saw or a jigsaw for your funny shapes. Now, when we do the second row, we want the seams of the mats to be staggered from the first row. So we create almost like a brick bond kind of pattern. So what we're doing here is the last mat of the first row obviously doesn't land, so it's a perfect full-size mat. So we've cut it and that's left us with an offcut. So we're then going to start the second row with that offcut. So then we're maximizing the material. We're not ending up with a lot of wastage, and it means that this seam lands here, whereas the seam for the first row lands here. So when we put in our next whole mat, we're going to have staggered seams and a nice brick bond. So we've just laid the very last piece of mat. So the floor is now completely covered. So the next step is we're just going to go around and have a bit of a look, because there are certain areas where we do still have some very, very small gaps. Now, the thing is, Every wall isn't perfectly straight and the floor isn't going to be perfectly level, and there are little awkward areas where we've got door frames and radiators and things. So you're never going to get all of the mats to perfectly butt up against each other, or for the mats to perfectly butt up against the gripper risers. It would take weeks and weeks and weeks of perfect measuring and scribing to get that. Now, all of the gaps are only very small, only a couple of millimeters. You certainly don't want any bigger gaps than kind of 4 or 5 mil. So what we're going to do is just go around and find all the gaps and run a bead of acoustic sealant into those gaps. Now, there may be gaps between the gripper riser and the SoundMat. There may be gaps between SoundMats, and there may be gaps between the gripper riser and the skirting board. So have a look at all those areas, and then we're going to put some acoustic sealant in there. Just run a bead before we start taping up. So we finished doing the acoustic sealant. So the floor is now completely sealed and airtight. So no sound should now be coming up through any gaps. The last touch is just over the joins of the mats. We're going to tape the joins together with a very high tack silicone tape. Now, a lot of other standard kind of tapes and gaffers won't actually stick to the mass loaded vinyl. So that's why we provide this special silicone tape, which does grab onto it and sticks very, very well. So we're going to tape over every join so the mats are joined together, and if there is any movement at all, they'll all move together as one, not as individual tiles. So that's it, we're all finished here at the Sportsman's Arms, and I tell you what, it's really made a huge difference. We've got the TV on downstairs, it's playing at a pretty reasonable volume, and upstairs, with no sound going on in this room, you can barely hear anything at all. If you literally got down on your hands and knees and put your ear to the floor, you can just hear the very faintest whisper of sound coming through. Vice versa, people walking around on the floor above, it's made such a difference to that thudding and impact traveling down. Now, in terms of installation time, it took us a day to lay the whole floor, and that's with stopping and starting for filming as well. If you just cracked on with installation, it wouldn't have even taken a full day. In terms of cost, the room is just under 14 metres square and worked out at around £850 for all the materials, the mats, the sealants, the tapes, the gripper risers, everything. VAT, delivery, all in, around £850. So we are back at the Sportsman's Arms in Pateley Bridge. It's been a couple of weeks since we were here doing the installation of the soundproofing. Now, we had to wait a couple of weeks before we could come back and do a test, because we were also soundproofing the wall as well as the floor, which means before we could test it, we had to wait for a plasterer to come out and skim the wall so we could fix the skirting boards back on and run a bead of sealant down that side and get that last bit finished off and sealed. But that's all done. The room's halfway through being redecorated, so we thought perfect opportunity to come back and do a test. So we're going to redo our airborne test and our impact test with our little handheld meter and see what the difference is from the test we did before. So we're in the room below. We've got the music playing upstairs, averaging around 70 decibels, which again is much higher than you'd actually expect anyone to be watching the TV or playing music in a hotel room, but just for the test. So it's averaging about 70 decibels upstairs. Let's see what it's doing down here. And now for an impact test. Again, we've got a colleague upstairs walking around on top of the SoundMat. You can certainly hear the difference down here. You can still hear the footsteps, but it's a lot quieter than it was before. But what does the dB meter say? So the soundproofing has made an absolutely fantastic difference. Again, we're not aiming for silence. We've not been able to decouple the ceiling or take out the spotlights or anything like that. We're not aiming to turn the bedroom into a completely soundproof recording studio, but it's really made it so much better than it was before. In terms of the airborne test, you know, what we could hear very loud and very clear before is now a much lower volume. It's more muffled. You can hear it, but it's so much more comfortable now to listen to. It's not a loud, distracting sound. We actually also measured the room when there was absolutely no noise at all. It was absolute silence, and measured it. And the dB meter was already reading 35 to 36 decibels. So our test was only about a decibel over the background noise level, which is fantastic. In terms of the impact, I think that's where it's really made the biggest difference. Before, the impact was so hard, the vibration was so strong, it was very clear, that thud, thud, thud. Afterwards, again, you can still hear it. You can tell that there's someone walking around upstairs, but it's a lot lower volume. It's much more kind of muffled and cushioned and softer. It's really made a big difference. The dB figures certainly say that, but what's more important is how do the owners feel about it. So let's go and have a chat with Jamie. Jamie, tell us from a point of view of you installing it yourself, how did you find it?
I think the product's absolutely great. The installation was much easier than what I had imagined beforehand. I think the fact that the SoundMat comes in small, manageable sections really makes it a lot easier to fit myself. And it was quite a simple job. It's just a case of assembling what is quite a simple jigsaw puzzle, little bits of pieces together, and making sure that the mats are offset. We're due to have the carpet fitted tomorrow, and the carpet fitter came and was really impressed with the job that we'd done. And I think that's down to the advice and the expertise that I've been given from the soundproofing store, who obviously you were here to give me those cues, but it means that we've got the gripper risers in, and it means that the carpet fitters can just come and lay the carpet straight down without having to tamper with anything or go back and redo a job that wasn't
process. They can just come in and do what they normally do. They've not got to worry about the fact that the soundproofing there.
They said they've worked on projects similar to this with different products, and it's been incorrectly fitted. The tiles not being offset and no risers next to the skirting board, which meant they would then have to go back and recut some of the boards and make it suitable for their part of the project.
That's a really important point. If you are installing carpet on top of the SoundMat, it is very, very important that you do use the gripper risers, or it's really going to confuse things further down the line when your carpet fitter comes.
Yeah.
But in terms of the results, the soundproofing, I know you've spent a bit of time in here the last couple of weeks while you've been kind of redecorating and finishing off. How has it been?
Yeah, it's been great. We're really pleased with the results. We've had customers in the room directly below us, and we've had people working in here and decorating, and I'm really impressed with the amount of sound that it's actually stopped. I haven't noticeably heard anyone in the room below when the televisions have been on and when they've been talking, and I think it's really stopped a lot of the transfer of footfall going from this room down to the room below. So really successful project, and really happy that we've worked with you on it.
What an absolutely fantastic result, and exactly what we'd hoped to have achieved here. And what a pleasure it's been to help solve a problem at such a fantastic venue that is now going to allow the guests of this hotel to have a nice, peaceful and relaxing and tranquil time. And if you have a similar project that you are looking at in terms of soundproofing a floor, whether it's in your home, whether it's a flat, whether it's an office, a place of work, a hotel, or anything else, you know where to find us. Get in touch and we can help you with that project. Or any other soundproofing project, whether it's walls, floors, ceilings. All you need to do is visit soundproofingstore.co.uk or give us a call. We're here to help.